Okay, Steve. So yeah, I wanted to thank you. To start off, yeah, I wanted to thank you for your work, for your book, because honestly, A Liberated Mind has definitely done its work when it comes to my life and my struggles with acceptance. I would say I think a lot of people who can identify with, being stuck in their heads and having some troubles with letting go of the past, of their thoughts, of the need to control everything about their lives. So I wanted to definitely thank you for writing the book and doing your work around the ACT method, because it has definitely changed something, and it clicked in my brain. Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear, and that's kind of what I'm here for. And you're not the only one. I think it's kind of part of our life task is what do we do with difficult thoughts and feelings? And human beings don't have an easy job of that, because they have skills that are useful and then not useful, and it's hard to distinguish one from the other. And so if you do what's logical and reasonable and sensible, sometimes it's also what's pathological, and you don't know that until things aren't working well. So it's hard to be human.
Yeah, I agree. And I can definitely see some hope, because when I read your book, there were a lot of, personal aspects of it when you shared about your story and your journey with anxiety and panic attacks. And I think I wanted to start off with asking you, how all of those personal experiences have shaped the ACT method and your work around acceptance and commitment, because I feel like, it is it's giving me a lot of hope when I see a person who has struggled themselves and this person creating something so meaningful and something that changes other people's lives. So maybe if you could share how have those experiences influenced you and the method you have created.
Well, I'm a psychologist, and when I ran into my own struggles, when it's not that I ran into it. It wasn't that it wasn't there and then was there. It was that I was sort of getting away with trying to do things that, in hindsight, were pretty unhealthy, such as suppressing anxiety. And eventually, thankfully, I wouldn't have known to thank myself for this, but part of me just said, "No, I'm not going to let you get away with that," and I ended up really having to choose whether or not I was going to function at all or do something different. And part of what was really difficult in that phase was applying with my clients things that I was told were supposed to be so great and grand, but that didn't work for me. And that always felt fraudulent. That's just not where you want to be, where you're recommending things that aren't helpful to you for people who have problems that are the same as yours. But on the other side of the ACT work, it's not like that. I mean, I'm trying to apply these principles every day and have been doing it for now 40 years. The first ACT workshop was given in 1982, and we're coming up on a little later than October. So it's 40 years old, and I'm 73. So for half my life, I've been trying to apply these principles. And the answer to this question is, I think that we should really expect of things that are supposed to help us evidence that they work, knowledge about why they work. And if they are based on something as broad as the ACT model, evidence that the person who is teaching or talking or whatever knows something about how to apply these methods to themselves. Because otherwise, that doesn't mean that you're some guru. It doesn't mean you're some great and grand. I mean, that doesn't mean that at all. In fact, I've learned early on not to trust gurus at all, and I've tried to eliminate that from from the ACT community as best as you can, kind of wall off. No, it just means that you're taking it seriously enough to have understanding about how hard it is to do some of the things that are so easy to say. I mean, there's a lot of shrinks saying a lot of things, and some of them are, that'd be fine if you could do it, but who the heck could do that? And so I don't think people should trust processes that aren't personally relevant for themselves. and for the person who is saying that it applies, if it should apply to them as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very, maybe not easy, but it's much easier to grasp things intellectually rather than, trying to apply it into your life and feel it and live it. And I think for me, at least, this is the biggest difficulty, that I can read a lot of books about acceptance and about, letting go and stuff. But then when it comes to my life and my conflicts and my, need for letting go, this is a whole nother story, Because I can intellectually, I can rationalize situations, but can I actually implement this sort of attitude into my life when it happens, when the conflict or a troublesome situation happens? That's a different story.
Yeah, that's it. And I think the people listening right now are listening because they're hoping that they'll hear something that applies to themselves. I do think that part of us really kind of hopes for this, just give me the answer.
Yeah.
But especially ones that I don't have to really work on and ever fail at. But these skills, although they're learnable, are more like learning how to walk. The average child falls down about 110 times a day when they're learning to walk.
Yeah.
While walking the length of 10 football fields, which exhausts their parents and them as well. And that goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks before they're able to, catch themselves and take that first step and begin to, learn a very, very complex skill. It's not that different, except it doesn't take as long.
Yeah.
To learn these psychological flexibility skills. You can learn them, and soon enough, then you can judge yourself whether or not they're helpful.
Yeah. So where do we start, Because even though there's no right and wrong answers, I feel like there must be some sort of starting point. Even looking at your book and seeing all of the techniques and methods that you created, there must be some sort of, ground zero where you can, start to implement more of a accepting, but also values-based approach towards life that you describe in your book a lot.
Yeah, the psychological flexibility model is actually one thing, but you can talk about it as three things, but you can talk about it as six things. The three things are kind of easy to understand. You need to learn to open up more, to come into the present moment consciously and to focus on what's important, to begin to do that. That's three things: open, aware, and actively engaged in life. Each of those three things has two aspects to it. And they're like sides of a box. They go together, and when they go together, they're one thing called a box. If you pulled it apart, you put each side on the floor, they'd just be squares. Then it's not a box, it's just the thing. And it doesn't really hold together. You can't put anything on it. There's lots of things you can't do. It's just a square on the floor. But if you put them in the right relationship, you can do cool things with them. But, you can build things with them and so forth, and it's useful. Metaphorically, it's kind of like that. And if you ask where you start, it helps to know that where you're going to end up is all six things, no matter where you start. Why? Because they all go together. So let's take something like values. If you haven't really had a good values conversation with yourself, if you've not thought that through, and of course, immediately misunderstandings come, because values sounds a lot like evaluation. It sounds like judgment, and it's almost the exact opposite of what values are. Values are these chosen qualities of being and doing that are intrinsic to what we do. They're adverbs, they're qualities like lovingly, genuinely, honestly, compassionately. They tend to have that kind of quality of action, kind of mark. And because of that, when you show up to, really, I do want to live my life in a way that's genuine or compassionate or loving or whatever. As soon as you do that, you're actually doing that value, because showing up to that value and owning it is part of doing it. And you're on a journey where it'll never be finished. I mean, if you do something lovingly, starting with owning up to the fact that you want to do that's what you're up to, that's what you're about for whatever reason. no matter how much you do of that, there's going to be more to do of that. It's not like you're going to like love for 5 minutes and then go out and hurt people. It's not the way that works.
Yeah.
Well, but in order to really behave lovingly, to live lovingly, you're going to have to face some of these other flexibility processes. For example, love and loss goes together. You can't name anything or anyone or any that where love doesn't apply, where there's not a sense of vulnerability about loss. And if you give it enough time where there's not the experience of loss. After all, anybody that you love can die.
And will die eventually.
Enough time, some will. And if you're still alive, that's going to be very painful. You're going to feel abandoned. You're going to, feel that loss. And it's in direct proportion to the loving journey that loss will impact you. So if you're not open to loss, how can you be open to love? Well, the answer is you can't. And furthermore, you won't. You won't. And, most of us have the experience of betrayal in love relationships of one sort or another. You're no longer the special one, the wanted one. You've been lied to or cheated on. You've been betrayed in some way. Or somebody who you really hoped would just love you back was never interested in you, and on, right? You don't have to be beyond middle school before you have experiences like that. And everybody does, right? And what your mind does when you have that experience is it tells you, okay, I will never be so vulnerable again.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let anyone else wound me the way that wound happened. Yeah, but if people are close to you, they can wound you. Right?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, because it hurts so much to lose love, I'll make sure that I can't ever have it again. Of course, it's idiotic, but it's very human. And if you watch yourself, you'll see yourself do it. You'll see that the next relationship, for example, you've just been through a big betrayal, let's say, and it's only months or half a year, even a year later. But that's not long enough. Time doesn't heal it, just soothes it a little bit. It doesn't really heal it. Healing requires more than time. You might find yourself doing really odd things like picking a fight with a new boyfriend.
Yeah.
Why? Because you feel vulnerable. And you start watching out. What if he's actually lying to me? Sometimes you're picking a fight. Or you're doing other things, refusing to answer the phone when the phone rings and you see who is called.
Yeah.
I betcha, if you just look at yourself, if I'm talking to those listening, you'll see that when you have been betrayed, or that you'll face places where there's this impulse to detune your own interests. So that's one example. All these 6 things are all interrelated. It's just one. It's a powerful one. That behaving lovingly requires learning how to be open, even with past betrayals. Because the knowledge that you can be lied to, for example, will never go away. Short of brain injury, there's no delete button in the nervous system. You'll go to your grave with a memory of that betrayal.
Yeah. What
are you going to do about that? You can't go back to like hearts and flowers, guys on big horses or white picket fences. You can't go back to Candyland. What you did when you were 12 or 13, maybe, or whenever before innocence was lost. Yeah? You're not going back to that. So how are you going to do both? How are you going to open yourself up, knowing full well you can be hurt? And that's what ACT is about. And it walks through that in area after area, in our judgments and our cognitions, in our emotions, our memories, and our felt bodily senses, and our attentional processes, and who we even take ourselves to be, and in how we build our habits, and what those habits are actually about. What are the qualities that we want to put in our own behavior? So, a long answer. So excuse me for that.
No, go for it.
back to your question, where do you start? Is wherever you start, where you'll end up, probably is all six sides of the box. Life is going to ask you to learn how to be more open, aware, and actively engaged. And to be open, it's going to have to be cognitively flexible and emotionally flexible. To be aware, it's going to have to be in the present moment from this more noticing sense of self, pure awareness, and actively engaged. It's going to have to involve values, choices, and actually creating habits around them. So I would say start wherever the biggest issue is. But don't worry about it too much, since that they're all pathways and doorways to the same place. Learn to be more psychologically flexible as a whole human being.
Yeah, I think there's something very powerful about the flexibility aspect that you talk about. Even though when you describe the situation with betrayal, my first thought is that, there's some sort of need for protection. So we kind of need some time, for example, before we enter into another relationship, because if you were hurt, you need some time to heal in order to be ready to open up to the possibility of being hurt again. I feel like this is the case. So maybe some sort of self-compassion needs to be present to be able to also protect ourselves, because if you have just been betrayed, you're probably not ready to, do it all over again a week later.
Sure, giving yourself time is important, but the quality of what you do with that time is also important. And you use the word heal, the root of that in Latin means whole. How do you make yourself whole when it's sort of as if you've been split asunder by a painful wound? And part of that goes back to, how do we create a safe place where it's okay to be you as one whole human being, with your history, with things that have happened that are painful, and including these, very dramatic or pain things of betrayals, but also the things you've done. Because there's probably things you're guilty about that you feel badly about when you realize that you've betrayed others, or you haven't lived up to how you want to be, and you've done things that are dishonest, on it goes. How do you do that? How do you create this experienced innocence of a whole human being who's willing to step forward and be open, knowing that you can be hurt, and yet needing that safe place? Well, I think the safe place is found in the ability, the experienced ability to actually go through pain and find a part of you that is not threatened by that. There's a deeper sense of self, a more spiritual sense of self, if I could say it that way, that's not threatened by, but just learns by your own history, even when it's hellacious. And not just hellacious, learning from joy and connection and love and contribution. So, but I think just giving yourself time, period, sense of end of story. Self-compassion, yes, if it's really what that means, but sometimes that just means self-soothing. Sometimes that just means, something right out of, affirmations, I'm okay, and I'm a lovable person. Oh, please give me a break. That's fine until, as we say, the shit hits the fan. That's fine until things go really badly. And there's actually data on that. That kind of self-reassurance is not very deep. With the kind of self-compassion we're talking about is to actually create a place where you can feel how hard it is to be human. And you can show up even to that moment in a way that empowers you to be a whole person. And that requires some new skills. That requires things that are not right out of a rule book. They have to be by experience.
I think it definitely requires this aspect of acceptance, because what you just talked about, accepting the fact that it is hard, that we as people experience struggles, and it's not, and it applies to us as well. Like we need this sort of acceptance as well. But I definitely wanted to, if we're talking about acceptance, I definitely wanted to ask you about the diffusion technique, because I found it very useful and important, especially for people with a very loud inner critic, or you call it the dictator within, which I love. And I wanted to ask you about, how, instead of just reading about diffusion, how to actually implement the diffusion technique that is not identifying with your automatic thoughts and being able to distance yourself and maybe try to look at it from a different perspective instead of automatically becoming one with your thoughts.
Yeah, you've said it very well. And the kind of distance we're talking about is not the dissociative defensive kind of distance, but the kind that you get. A metaphor I always use would be like if somebody showed you a painting and you really wanted to appreciate it, so you got up close and put your nose on it, you're not going to be able to see the painting from that perspective. Yeah. If you step just a couple steps back and create a little bit of distance, you can see the whole painting. And thoughts are like that. Sometimes they present so powerfully that there is as if your nose is pressed into them. And you need to take a couple steps back, not to diminish or get away, but to be able to see, appreciate, observe, understand, describe, to catch the qualities. What is that? To catch the voice. Have I heard that before? I bet that's mom's voice. To catch, to notice when they rise and fall, to notice what your body does when you think them, to notice your pulls and urges, to be able to remember, I've had thoughts like that in the past, and what has happened when I've followed them, and what has happened when I haven't, so that you can become wiser, because not all thoughts are helpful. All thoughts are indicative of a history showing up in this moment. But thinking is a very wild horse. I mean, we can think about almost anything in almost any way. That's part of what's wonderful about human beings. It's why we can create worlds that have never been, and imagine and invent and create art and science and all of that. It's also why you can torment yourself with things that'll never happen, or have 1,001 different variations about the same useless things that you would think you'd learn by trial and error. Don't follow your mind when it tells you to do that. No, but it's smarter than that. It'll give you 1,000 different variants, and each one will say, this one's different.
Oh, yeah.
And it really will work. This time's for like, and it'll fool you, trick you once again. So diffusion is just a word for techniques that diminish the excessive domination of analytic, judgmental, literal thought on the present moment, when other things could regulate your life, your behavior at that moment that would be more useful. It's that little stepping back so that you have a choice, and not to eliminate or diminish, but so you can see and have a choice. Now, once you see that that's important and it applies to every thought, it isn't a way to disbelieve. It isn't a way to, X out, diminish, erase, criticize. It's not a tricky form of mental manipulation. It's a habit of an observational style as applied to literal thought. If you have the thought like, I'm great and grand, you want to use diffusion there too. Enough to just step back so that you could easily say, I'm having the thought that I'm great and grand, which is true. You just had that thought. That doesn't mean you're great and grand. It just means you had thought you're great and grand. Now, you probably wouldn't think to use diffusion there, but you better, because when it comes to I'm the lowest of the low and the worst of the worst, if you only apply it there, you'll apply diffusion methods as a secret way of sort of getting rid of the bad and only having the good. And that itself is a fused idea. That itself is something that your mind will tell you you need to do to live well. That is nonsense, doesn't fit the data, and it blows up on people because it invites you to get rid of these and to cling to those. Both of those are a train wreck.
Yeah.
Avoiding or clinging.
Yeah.
Let thoughts do what they do. Let them rise and fall, bump you in the direction. If they're useful, let them go of them. If they're not, they convey information. They're useful noticing, but not entangling. So I have a TEDx talk. People can search it easily enough, where I quickly go through 12 diffusion exercises. And of course, all these books and websites and all that teach lots more. There's hundreds of them. I do 12 because I wanted to get a feel, and I did it at a school that's here at the University of Nevada for children who have IQs at the 99.99 percentile, baby geniuses, and they have as much or more mental problems as anybody.
Oh, yeah. No pressure, no pressure. Just be the smartest kid, in your country. No pressure at all.
Yeah, I mean, these kids may be smart, but that doesn't mean they're smart about the world within. And, being able to step back and say, hey, is this thought helpful for me? Applies no matter how brilliant your thoughts may typically be.
Yeah.
In the TEDx talk I did at that school, I wanted to do it to sort of give them a full range. And some of the things I did were things that are kind of funny, like giving your mind a name. I call mine George, and why would you want to give your mind a name?
Oh, I actually have a name as well. Yeah, but it's actually fictional character. So the name is Dolores Umbridge. If you've ever watched Harry Potter, there's this really annoying, controlling, bossy headmistress. She works at the Ministry of Magic and then becomes the headmistress of Hogwarts. She's like the biggest, jerk in the whole movie. And I definitely feel like my voice speaks with her voice, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I know the character, and I can see how that's a good name. Well, and when you do, like, what does Doris have to say? Yeah. It gives you that space, because if somebody else were to be saying what your mind says to you, you would naturally, think about, is that really helpful? Mm. But when it's in your own voice, and it even claims to be you, that voice disappears into the fabric, and you can be tricked by it. So giving your mind a name creates a little bit of healthy separation. And I go through other ones, like singing a difficult thought that really has you hooked to the tune of Happy Birthday, or pick a song that you like, just sing it. Let's actually try it, or distilling it down to word and saying it over and over again for at least 30 seconds. But in that TEDx talk, I finished with this one, and the reason I'm mentioning it is I wanted to give it the spirit of it. I finished with an exercise where I asked the audience to think of a time of how small they were when they first had thoughts like that. And most people, if you kind of step back and look at the thoughts that really punch you, yeah, the exact details may be very adult and whatever. But the core of that thought is usually we're back in elementary school.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not uncommon to be back in early elementary school. Just little ones who are 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. And so I take a time to ask the person to picture themselves at that age, and to remember what clothes you wore and what your hairdo was like, and the goofy shoes you wore at the time, and all of that. And then I asked the person to take that difficult thought and have the child that you've just imagine that they're right there in front of you, say those difficult thoughts out loud in the voice you had as a child. And what would you do if you could actually confront yourself, hearing yourself say things like, deep down there's something wrong with me, or I'm unlovable and no one will ever really love me, or whatever it is. It's not uncommon, if I'm doing this in a workshop, that people will cry during that exercise.
Yeah.
And these other diffusion methods, the reason I have that at the end, are not ridiculing yourself. You're not ridiculous. You're human. And there's that sweet, sad quality of seeing how the human mind works, that it will constantly torment us, even with thoughts that are very, very painful.
Mm.
And so diffusion has inside it this compassionate place. It's metaphorically the same as what you'd probably do to yourself if you actually could confront yourself saying words out loud, like what you say to yourself in the morning when you brush your teeth about that person in the mirror. When Ms. Umbridge is doing her thing on you, and being very, very harsh. If you wanted a word for what diffusion lands like, self-compassion wouldn't be a bad word for it. Because my guess is, if you would confront yourself as a child with difficult thoughts, I'd ask you, what comes to mind? What would you do if you were in front of yourself and hearing yourself speak like that in a child's voice? If you could meet yourself back when you first started having difficult thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think I would be that harsh if I heard it, seeing myself as a 5-year-old, saying stuff like, I'm not good enough. I don't think my reaction would be, you have to press harder. You have to, work harder. You're not, I think I would be much more considerate and loving and supportive than I am, towards myself. And I think this goes very well in hand with something that, a lot of young people, a lot of young ambitious people struggle with. And you also talk about it in the book, that is, perfectionism and workaholism. So this kind of persistence to be constantly striving for more, to be growing. But if you look at it, it usually doesn't come from a place of acceptance and curiosity, but it's more about punishing yourself for not being good enough. And I feel like your method definitely, could find a lot of use in that sort of area of life.
Yeah, I agree. And so that spirit of, what you might actually do if you met yourself, of giving yourself a hug, treating yourself with kindness, being loving to yourself, can be brought into the adult that you are. And when you have those kind of perfectionistic things, there's nothing wrong with trying to be excellent at something, to be competent at something. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with it is this driven, judgmental, harsh, negative, avoidant kind of poke in the ribs as if you're a horse to be whipped. You're not. And life is, not about that. So how could you treat yourself in a values-based way, lovingly, for example? Not by demanding that you spring forth in the head of Zeus and be perfect tomorrow. To be on a journey that includes excellence, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not perfectionism. Perfectionism is this weird idea that you have to start without a flaw or else. And it's backed up by threats and threats of removing from yourself the support that you need to be able to be a whole, free person who can play at the wonderful things we get to play with, of creating and contributing and learning and doing. You can feel it in the vitality of it. Perfectionism doesn't produce vitality. It produces this kind of obsessive, neurotic, driven, mindless quality where you don't even have time to celebrate your accomplishments or to be kind to yourself when things have not gone well.
But it's interesting how people talk about it, because oftentimes people say, I'm such a perfectionist, which is kind of, like a strength to be, it's kind of glorifying.
Massively supported in the culture, isn't it? Because it is true that some of that driven quality may even produce competence. But it's not the kind of competence that's full and free, and that's not all that you can be. I mean, it's really, really hard, for example, to be fully creative with a gun to your head. And wanting to be practically perfect in every way today means you better not try and fail.
Yeah.
Well, most people who are competent at things that are hard repeatedly tried and failed. We're coming up on the Winter Olympics here soon. We're going to watch some incredible athletic performances. Every single one of those persons has tried and failed 1,000 times at the things that they're showing. And so I understand some of that comes from driven perfectionistic quality, but you follow the life history of high performers, of athletes and business people and so forth. I've done a fair amount with sports. ACT has gone into Olympics, for example. There's many, many ACT coaches in the Olympics, but also in professional sports and all of that. And, if you just follow the life history of really high performers, what is their most likely source of failure? It's burnout, exhaustion, crashing and burning around relationships, falling apart, getting so out of balance that you almost forget who you are. And so it's kind of a metaphor. It's a little warning sign of be careful. Don't support that quite so much.
Yeah.
I'm fine with supporting people working hard to do excellent things, but I don't really want to support people in doing things that are actively harming themselves. And some of this perfectionism that we put into the culture, it's not very hard. Get out there and just look at the YouTube and world and so forth. It's not very hard to go from things that kind of sound like health and wellness and to, being Ms. Perfect.
Yeah. And I mean, nowadays doing everything online and being constantly, under this pressure that people are judging you, people are commenting on your work, people are, essentially talking about your worth. If you're so engaged in your work, if it's a creative work, for example, you kind of take it personally because you feel like your work is you. So I feel like there's this very fine line between, growing, working on yourself, being engaged, and then being so, vulnerable because you identify with everything that you do, that you take all of those comments, likes, the amount of followers as something that defines your worth. And that is a scary place to be. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it is a scary place and it'll hollow you out. And look at what happens to people when they start chasing likes and things like that. It's not a pretty picture. It's not. And, people need to come by wisdom however they come by it. So I don't want to just criticize. All I would say is good luck and let me know if you how that turns out. And if it turns out that there's some additional things, well, there are resources there. And part of what I've tried to do with the ACT work is really create a sense of community or something and a kind of a worldwide effort, and to not grab it and try to own it and all of that. I did instigate it. I lit the little match that led over a 40-year period, but so many other people have brought creative and wonderful ideas to it. If I can give an example, one I'm really kind of proud of and had nothing to do with other than lighting that match 40 years ago. There's the World Health Organization is now distributing ACT in 18 different languages. If you go there and you say, I'm distressed about COVID, the only one thing that they'll recommend to you is an ACT protocol. And it's a picture book, a graphic novel, really basically, plus an audio tape in 18 languages. But where that was tested was with South Sudanese refugees who had escaped to Uganda with nothing but their children and their clothes on their back. That's it. And then tested again with Syrian refugees living in Turkey or in the EU. And those three big world-class gold standard trials are what has allowed the World Health Organization to adopt it. Yeah, but what's cool about it is, speaking just as myself, looking at it myself, is the people who are involved in developing this, but then the people who are involved in actually deploying this are just normal people. mean, the excellent researchers, but the people who are doing the trainings in these big studies that are testing it are not even psychologists. Sometimes they have a high school diploma. And so could we, here's where it lands. Could we empower each other to be there for each other in a way that makes sense with what the best of science can point towards, but that also allows different communities and their cultures and the different people and what they aspire to be able to bring their ideas into the world? Could we soften the world and empower the world to be a more values-based place in all the areas where we need it? Immigration, refugees, things like that, but climate change and, the political divides that we have, and on it goes, the economic disparities. And you're facing that in your country too.
Oh, yeah.
Big issues. And I'm following it with interest. But I'm really interested in what people there are doing to be able to work on kind of humanizing some of these issues so that we can heal. I think it's you take the aspirations that people have that are behind the perfectionism, behind the likes, behind the YouTubeization of our culture and stuff in there. They're not bad. They're a yearning to belong, to be liked, to be loved, to make contributions. What we need to do, though, is find a way to empower each other to sort of be our best and to step up and be there for others and ourselves.
Yeah.
We leave something behind that's, wow.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about this because I remember when I was maybe 16 and I think someone asked me about, what are your values? And I remember, having a blackout and being like, I have no idea what my values are. How do you even categorize it? And when I read your book, I realized that values are to be found in things that you care about, things that you pay more attention to, things that, make you suffer if there's not enough of it, or if there's some sort of conflict, if your value is, for example, meaningful relationships. And I realized that this is what it's about, how to identify values, maybe not necessarily try to list them and put them into your notebook, but maybe try and look at your life and see where you engage the most. Like, what do you care? Where do you care for something more than you care for something else?
Yeah, I agree. And, the things that were in the culture that were about that, some of those have really weakened. I mean, some of ours, at our best, our spiritual and religious traditions were about that. At their worst, they turned to a whole bunch of rules and like the religious wars and all the rest. But at their best, it's human beings trying to figure out what's important. And so nowadays, I think more and more people are looking to, well, what about the mental health side of things and so forth? And nobody nominated shrinks to be, spiritual leaders. But they do need to really look at issues like this, because we know that if you're not clear about your values, if you haven't gone through a place of sort of owning them, all kinds of things don't play out in your life in ways that are empowering. It's really important to know what you deeply care about. And if you just think about it for a microsecond, you can see why. There's no way you're going to head in the direction of what you deeply care about if you don't know what you deeply care about. Yeah. You're not going to move in the direction you want to move in if you don't even know what direction you want to move in, other than by random chance. And that's so. It turns out, actually, I think it's that you can say in 4 words what readily moves you towards more values awareness and ownership. I think sweet, sad heroes and stories. Those sweet moments in any area you stop, those places where you wake up, it's vital, it's cool. I don't mean like you won the lottery. I mean that. I don't mean that. I mean there's something about this that just is cool. There's something about this that is like, yes. Slow it down, unpack it. You're going to find your values in there. Take the ones that are most painful, most difficult, most sad, most distressing. Take those things, flip them over. Look at what does that suggest you care about. You'll find your values. Take your heroes and guides, the people you look up to. Even if you don't know them. I mean, the characters of stories, you mentioned one you didn't look up to. How about the ones in there with Harry Potter? Pick it that you do look up to, and then slow it down. And you'll find that there's something in there that you yearn to put into your life. Not being a wizard, probably. No. But, the putting in some of these qualities, whether it's courageously living or genuinely living. And then stories, if you were writing your own story and you couldn't pick the characters, you couldn't pick the incidents, you don't know that, even though those may show up. A plane may fly into your building in the next 5 seconds. I mean, you don't know what's going to be in there by content. But you can say, what kind of story am I writing? And this particular chapter, am I writing a tragedy? Or am I writing a hero's journey? And that's up to you. And so owning your own authorship of your life, not in the content, that's not up to you. You may have a cancer diagnosis that won't show up for another week. You don't know. A friend may call you about a horrible, they may have COVID and they're on a ventilator. I mean, you don't know. But you can say, this is the story I'm writing. And if you look at, once you've gone to it, you look around you, you see so much of our culture. It's not even just the spiritual religious traditions, but why are great stories great stories? Why are great artists looked up to? Why does that song get repeated? Why is that painting so powerful? Why is that dance moving to me? Why is, why is that poem resonant? Yeah. We as human beings have been about this business of creating meaning and purpose and peace of mind for the whole time we've been Homo sapiens. And maybe even before, some of the hominins may as well. As I know it, by the time we got what you and I are doing right now, these questions are so front and center. By the time you got symbolic language in the room, and Homo sapiens for sure had that. Maybe some of the hominids did. The chimpanzees we know don't, because they don't do what your baby does when it's 12 months old. That is kind of the smoking gun. If you don't do that, you don't develop human language. They don't take signs or symbols and create a two-way street about them. And underneath ACT is a whole science of cognition, an active research program that's helping children that can't speak and things like that. But we've been at it a long time. And one of the things I would say to people listening about this is that if you feel as though, you're being challenged by these kinds of questions, I would say, A, good. B, you're not the only one, because this is what every human being before you has been challenged by and has been asked to step up to. And that doesn't mean any of us are good at it, but it does mean we're on a journey.
Yeah. And I definitely find a lot of comfort in that. And I think redirecting your focus into more of a values-based living brings some sort of comfort, because I feel like it's so easy to compare yourself to others and just fall into the trap of feeling like you're chasing something, but you don't know what, and everybody else has figured it out. That I think being, having this anchor of your values kind of keeps you more grounded, I would say, and puts you at ease. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. And I like that word, grounded. And I point out to some words in English. I don't know as they're in Polish, but I bet you it would be the same thing. Like words like humble. Humble comes from a word that means dirt.
Yeah.
It means feet on the ground. Humus, right? And so, I think, oddly enough, our aspirations owned as whole, more spiritual, could I say, human beings with a history that's painful, but opportunities in the present to deploy those values if we learn how to do that. This is a humble human journey. This is something that is great and grand in a way, but it's great and grand as the hero's journey. I mean, if you look at what the great stories have, it's almost always somebody who starts out as just a normal person, I mean, Luke Skywalker, suddenly shows up, there's a droid that gives him a mission. He's saying, who, me? I'm out here on a farm, what do you, or Lord of the Rings, if I'm just a little hobbit over here, don't ask me to, and, I'm not adequate. I'm not up to it. It's too scary. And, as the Yoda says, and he says, a little later on, he's having to go in and confront himself in that cage. And he says, I'm not scared. And Yoda says, you will be. Where you have the opportunity to face straight on your emotions and thoughts and self-judgments, and then come into the present situation, often with help of others. The Gandalfs show up, or the tribe you hope would show up, rides over with a bunch of horses at the last possible second to fight but often with help from others. So you're not on this journey all alone. And you connect with those values. This is about something of importance. That golden fleece needs to be had. That ring has to be cast into the crack of doom, or it's going to. And you find a way, step by step, arduously struggling up the mountain to find the cave where you can throw it in, or, all the great stories that all have that. And then when it all gets resolved, you're back in this normal state. You're still not great and grand. You just did that hero's journey. You brought something back to the community that's worthwhile. And now Harry Potter is on the train station sending his kid off to Hogwarts for his journey, for his hero's journey. Yeah. I think the reason why these things, these songs, these poems, these paintings, these dances, these therapy methods, these YouTubers, I think the reason, these movies, the reason that they are so powerful is that we all know that we're on a journey like that. It doesn't mean that you're Harry Potter.
Unfortunately.
Learning how to have relationships without, sabotaging them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm speaking with some personal experience. Ask my wife. But I'm learning, I'm still working at it. I'm not very good at it. I'm working at it, and so I don't know. I think science can kind of hold our hands and say, yes, these processes matter. These are worth focusing on. The other thing science can do is simplify, because there's so many different voices out there. And we can't learn the 120 different things that make a difference in our life, but we might be able to learn the 6 things. And the flexibility processes really do apply to so many things, that they're not the final answer, the ultimate answer, the only answer. They're not the only processes, but they're a pretty quick, small set that can get you going.
Yeah, for sure. Steve, I definitely would like to thank you for this talk, because it was a great addition to all of the knowledge that you shared in the book, and I feel like it expanded on a lot of topics. So I'm really grateful that you found some time and you had the willingness to meet up and talk online. I definitely would like to thank you because I find a lot of value and comfort in the ACT method, and I hope that the listeners or viewers will be inspired and maybe will like to read the book as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
I hope that as well, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks.